All right, welcome to the Rojas Reports Live. It looks like we've got some people in here already joining us. Thank you all so much for being here. And we've got a great guest again. We've got Adam Kehoe. He's not related to Donald Kehoe, if you're aware of who Donald is. As all of us UFO nerds know Donald Kehoe well. Worked with NICAP. Too early. My brain is not taking it. But anyway, one of the early military UFO organizations that was very, very influential when the Condon Report and when the Air Force stopped doing everything. But you're not related to Donald Kehoe anyway.
I almost wish I was. You know, it would be so much fun. But yeah, unfortunately, no. Different spelling of the name.
That's the biggest question I get when they're like, I saw you had Adam Kehoe on. Is he related to Donald Kehoe? No.
Yeah, Uncle
right.
Donald.
But Adam does have a PhD in information science, and I know you have a big interest in policy when it comes to defense, and that's something you write quite a bit about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the last couple of months, really, I've been writing intensively about kind of policy issues around UAP. So, you know, I came into this field kind of interested to try to think through all of the different possible implications, right? So there's a number of possibilities. You know, some of these things could be foreign adversaries, and there's a whole set of policy issues there. There could be mistaken observations, and that's important as well. And there's a few of these cases that are really, truly strange, and it doesn't seem like there's much of an organized policy response. So it's kind of fascinating to look at as a problem kind of at the intersection of technology and intelligence and government, kind of all of these things all at once.
And it's sort of a new puzzle. I mean, we're getting insight into an area of research that the military has been into secretively, and have successfully really kept the public and apparently Congress in the dark. And so, you know, which kind of, for the conspiracy theorists, you know, there was something there, and we don't know. We don't know the extent of the research that has been done by the military in this area, and we're just beginning to learn that sort of thing. And that'll probably be a lot of what we talk about, is that there seems to be, even though we know that they've taken UAP seriously now, there's still a lot of secrecy around what they've done. And they don't seem to want to change that level of transparency at all. I mean, what we've been getting lately is that things will remain classified in their research in these areas, it seems like. Does that seem accurate?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think this is an incredibly difficult intelligence problem, because in order to really look at this, you have to look at the very edge of your knowledge and capabilities. So you've got to simultaneously assess what are the best capabilities of our rivals and adversaries and even our peers. What are our own best capabilities? Is it a possibility that someone has an experimental platform that is in the wrong place at the wrong time? And then even if you're looking at the most prosaic thing, which is that it's a case of mistaken observation or whatever, that very quickly gets into vulnerabilities in the sensor layers, of the military, of where there might be problems with radar, where there might be problems in training, et cetera. So all of that is really sensitive stuff. And if you have to look at it all together, you're decompartmenting information. You're bringing information that normally would just be in separate parts of the government together. And that's always a cause for, extreme concern. Because if that program, is penetrated in any meaningful way, then that's essentially a treasure trove for a foreign intelligence service. So before we even get into any of the sort of stranger implications of some of these cases, the kind of more conspiratorial stuff, there's actually like good reason, even if you were only thinking about drones and planes and, radar glitches, to be really, really concerned about this stuff and to keep it fairly secretive. But as you say, the remarkable thing is that in the last year, amazingly, we're seeing this public discourse about it. We're seeing the Senate Intelligence Committee writing this really amazing request to basically say, we demand more or less a report on this, a public report, unclassified, in a relatively short period of time. That's sort of stunning, given all of the different, intelligence equities involved. But, nonetheless, here we are.
Mm-hmm. So two things, a little bit of business first, and then we'll get back into this conversation. Do want to let people know that I have made this change where now the Rojas Reports live, the live interviews like this one, anybody can join. And then after the interview, after a couple hours, I will make it so just the subscribers can join. And you can see there's a join button here on Open Minds where you can join and subscribe to the archives. Just do that one. I have the Rojas Reports live option there, but like I said, I'm gonna not charge for joining for live anymore. So just so you know, so welcome, and hopefully you can keep joining me. And part of the reason I'm doing this is because Rojas Reports is a moving target in that I never know when I'm going to get my guest. And so it's kind of short notice when I'm going to have people pop in here. But some of you, like Mark and Rodrigo and Renee and Dirk, you seem to be able to be available practically anytime and pop into any of these live streams that I pop up. And you're very welcome. Thank you for being here. The other thing I do want to mention is just getting back to our conversation here is that I was able to watch The Phenomenon, which is a great documentary. I highly, highly recommend it. I know you'll really love it, Adam, if you haven't gotten a screener yet.
I have not.
And what's great about it is that it reviews the history, which will bore maybe some of the, older UFO nerds. But they do it in a great way, a very credible way, and then come into, then bring it into the current affairs through the presidents, into Clinton and Podesta. And then we have, interviews with Chris Mellon, Harry Reid, great interviews, by the way. And it really demonstrates this truth, which is, and it doesn't include Jimmy Carter. And I do want to mention that as I did post an article from Open Minds magazine written by my buddy Antonio Huneas about Jimmy Carter when Jimmy Carter tried to get NASA to do UFO research. And we'll talk about that. That was excluded from Phenomena, but all this other was. And it does show that this is not necessarily an issue, that is not something that the military has always been struggling with, but instead kind of more of a PR issue, at least from the surface. The things that we know about is, how do they deal with this and how do they deal with the public on this matter? And that's what's great, is that it really combines things to show that what is going on now is really a continuation of what went on in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. It's just a new way of dealing with it and kind of this new openness that mirrors what we had in the beginning. And I don't think that's a problem. And I think that may be all we're left with in the end, in that back then we knew there was an issue. There were UAPs. There were things being seen by the public, by law enforcement, by the military, and it was okay. And the military is trying to figure out what it was. It seems like that was where we've returned to, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but of course it does pose some problems for the military.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key differences is just that the strategic environment has really changed. So, 20 or 30 years ago, we were, largely in this bipolar world where bipolar in terms of the power dynamic between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I think there was higher confidence in the kind of technological supremacy of the United States. And today we're in a much more multipolar world where, countries like China and Russia are increasingly capable and in different ways. And I think also with the proliferation of drone technology too, there's a certain anxiety that, the skies are becoming a little stranger, a little bit more accessible. It's not just the B-52 that you're concerned about, right? It's drones and all of these sort of strange new technologies and so on. So I think that it is a slightly different environment. And then I think the other new thing in the equation is something like TTSA, which has a few people with, really significant government backgrounds kind of coming in and adding their weight and experience to it, which seems to be a new aspect of the dynamic. But you're right. I mean, there's a long history, and not just of people being interested in the subject, but also the government having varying levels of response to it and varying levels of congressional interest and even executive branch interest in the case of Jimmy Carter. So yeah, there's a cyclical aspect to many of these things.
I think the Jimmy Carter story is a very interesting one, an important one also, in that it shows, Jimmy Carter wanted openness, much like Harry Reid, into this topic. So he approached NASA. And I think that's where the similarities are. This politician kind of inspired or started program, and how the military and NASA reacted. What they told Jimmy Carter, obviously, what Antonio was able to demonstrate in the article is that the Air Force behind the scenes was pushing for NASA to not do it. They're like, this isn't worth it. Just don't do it. Go away and get out of it. And they did. And they did highlight the issue, which is a legitimate issue, is that, if we don't do it, the UFO conspiracy people are going to be mad at us and claim that we're just covering things up. If we do it, then we're going to start to run into problems with the scientists that we work with in the scientific community. And that's the problem. So why do it at all? Because that just creates just so much problems. We're already, I think, an organization, NASA, has always had resource issues. They've always been, tasked with doing things that are just, they don't have the budget or the manpower to do. And that's kind of politics.
Yeah, if I could, just to add a little bit of context to that, I mean, to zoom out from that story a little bit. So there's the moment where Carter talks about UFOs on the trail and then commits to looking at them. But if you go back just a couple of years, there's something called the Church Committee in the Senate. And that was actually the precursor of the modern, it's essentially the Senate Intelligence Committee, the permanent sort of select intelligence committee. So what the Church Committee was doing really was looking at intelligence abuses. So this is a period when things like MK Ultra were coming to light, and all of these other sorts of the really dark corners of the intelligence world. And it's been a little while since I've looked at this, but I want to say that was maybe around 76 or so. So just before kind of the Carter era. So that was a moment in American life where I think people were looking at the intelligence services in a slightly different way and had a slightly different sort of perspective on government, and maybe a lack of trust in government as a whole. The other interesting thing that was happening at the time was that, the defense contractor giant, Lockheed Martin, in its earlier form, was in some financial trouble, and at one point was sort of quasi-nationalized almost. So that was a moment for the whole security apparatus to be pretty uncertain. And there were a lot of people, I think, professionals in the national security world, that were concerned about what Carter would do, that he would overturn basically the way that things were done. It's fascinating to go back and take a look at Carter's speech to the CIA when he was shortly after he was inaugurated, because he does it in his sort of gentle Carter way, but it's a really challenging speech, basically saying that, there has to be reform. So, it's fascinating that there was a whole moment of questioning and reform, a sort of spirit of reform. And yet this issue just kind of ran into the brick wall, nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. And I'd recommend people read that article. I think it's a really important part of everything going on. But I think it's probably some insight into what's been happening in the background that we haven't seen also. That, in other words, there are probably strong forces in the background completely opposed to transparency in this arena, and using their weight in ways that we don't see. One of the big mysteries you've brought up that I think a lot of us has talked about is the absence of Air Force involvement with any of what's been going on. There's been very little. They've spoken to one issue where they said they thought something that wasn't a drone, in other words, saying their one case was a true unidentified. They also investigated the F-18 FLIR videos to make sure that they were not, released unlawfully or in a manner that they shouldn't have been. That's it, though. That's all we've heard. They really haven't gotten involved at all on the surface. But, who knows what sort of movement's been going on in the background.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, if you look at Christopher Mellon's wish list, so to speak, he's written a few pieces now, and he's got one where he really just kind of enumerates a bunch of different platforms and capabilities, and many of them are Air Force capabilities explicitly. So, it seems as if on the inside, there's a desire to tap into data sets and expertise that might be in the Air Force. And what we don't know is how cooperative the Air Force has been with that interest. If they're outright blocking it, or if maybe at this point they're cooperative, it's so quiet, there's kind of no way to know. But yeah, as you point out, in that silence, it's sort of a strange silence, because clearly this is the domain that they're tasked with, is protecting our airspace. So you would expect to see some leadership. To me, just as someone who kind of watches the interbranch rivalries and those sorts of issues from a policy perspective, it's surprising because they risk ceding leadership to the Navy, which has always been one of their chief rivals. So it's sort of not a good look for them in a way, that the go-to place for all of these things is always O&I. Why is that the case? And, I think down the road, there might be some budgetary considerations with that, if O&I proves itself to be the most innovative. But it's also recruiting, because, the young person that's interested in STEM and, programming and all these sort of technological things, it might be O&I has the more exciting story to tell right now in terms of the work that they do than the Air Force does. So that bright kid is maybe going to think about a career in the Navy instead of the Air Force. So yeah, so one of the pieces I wrote was sort of pointing that out and saying, hey, this is an opportunity actually to take the leadership reins and really contribute.
Yeah, that is one aspect of this whole thing. That is supposedly what got Tom DeLonge's foot in the door, in that he approached the military. He says, to tell them, hey, you're not looking good to the kids, If you really want to attract the younger people, I think you really got to tackle some of these areas they're interested in, like UFOs. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have been picked up. I think that's a great opportunity for TTSA, the entertainment side, to maybe work with the military to kind of, sex up their how they're seen. That hasn't happened, but I agree with you. That is a good angle. And maybe the Navy thought that was a good angle. I know in my experience, even some of the NASA PR or some of the other science publicist people I've worked with like that angle. They're not afraid to go to the UFO route and use that as something to get people interested in. The scientists, of course, are much more hesitant to do so. But it's a good angle. The issue is, it seems as though the Navy has now started to change its tune a bit as far as transparency, because the last couple of, at least one of the messages, I think by Glassel, the Swedish researcher got, was from the Navy. And the Navy even was speaking to how a lot of their findings will be classified. And they even, put in this mention of questioning whether Elizondo was part of ATIP again, which is so weird, because that's an established, I think a pretty well-established fact with firsthand, witnesses, people who would know, like Harry Reid, who started, or the people who worked on the program. So it's almost like they're their tune now, and that I'm a little worried that the trans part of this thing is maybe getting in the mix.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, I think an important thing to remember always with government and the military is that it's never monolithic. People have different ideas, attitudes, and there often are kind of wrestling matches in the background, if you will, about whose ideas are going to prevail. And so, we may be seeing some shift in that, where people who maybe prefer a quieter approach are getting a little bit more of their way. It's very, very difficult to say. I think overall, though, I mean, in the last few weeks and months, yes, it does seem like there may be a bit of a shift, but I think overall, it's still in a fairly unprecedented place in terms of, they have this request to from the Senate Intelligence Committee. The DNI, it seems, is going to have to, the Director of National Intelligence is going to have to speak on this issue. Another thing that I pointed out in that Air Force piece that does apply here too, there was a curious thing. If you compared Christopher Mellon's blueprint with what ended up actually in the official language. So Mellon, I think, had an 18-month timeline. It was considerably longer than the short timeline in the Senate Intelligence Committee. And a lot of people have asked, is that enough time actually to do this job? And it makes me wonder that if there's a hearing someday, there's going to be a DNI that's, sitting in front of them. And if he or she doesn't have an adequate answer, the next question is going to be why? Who's holding things up, right? Why aren't we able to solve this problem that we know has been around at least 16 years if we just look at Nimitz? And that puts some pressure, because you don't want to be the person left holding the bag of holding things up. So because you're going to get some uncomfortable questions from the Senate, and that has massive ramifications in terms of the budget and so on. So you're right in that, like, publicly, and we as researchers and journalists and interested citizens, we may be getting less, but there's still an overall kind of chessboard that points to there being increased pressure that I think there's going to have to be some sort of a response to.
Right. And I think that at least the public side of things, Rodrigo brings up a great point here. He says, I'm very impressed with the fact that the UFO issue hasn't become more politicized, actually. And I think that's at the crux, and that's what I'm trying to argue right now, is that I think that nobody really knows the strength of the UFO lobby and the effect that it may or may not have. And I think that's kind of the biggest issue, in that do they have to play politics to this or not? And do they see the needle move at all when they do make comments or not? I'm guessing not. So, for instance, with Marco Rubio answered that question about, the way he did about all of this, saying that, I kind of hope they are aliens because it's scary if it's Russian or Chinese. Did he get a big response to that answer or not? I'm guessing no, but that's the sort of thing that are, people who feel like they're UFO activists, which I feel like a lot of the UFO community does, needs to make their voices heard, because I think that there's a lot of people that, a lot of UFO articles do really well in mainstream media. That shows there's people interested in reading the story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're interested in, petitioning more transparency in this arena. We could get to a point where the military says, okay, we take UAP seriously. We're now telling you this is a real phenomenon. So there's something happening here, but we've got it covered. We can't share with you everything we've discovered, but we've got it covered. End of story. I mean, that's the scenario I'm guessing that we're headed towards. And without a strong public response, it's probably where we're going to go.
Yeah, I think that's a distinct possibility. I think you're right that while these things are popular, the stories get a lot of clicks and views and so on. That doesn't mean there's a UFO vote out there, that a politician's really got to wrangle with. And the other thing to consider too is we may be in just about the noisiest and most chaotic political environment in modern memory. 2020 is a heck of a year. So if you're trying to register whether UFOs make a dent in the 20 other things, it's hard to know that. So yeah, I'm also a bit skeptical, of the idea that there's going to be a meaningful grassroots movement that's able to really pressure individual politicians. I think that can happen. I think a better strategy is to point out the obvious seriousness of the issue. So, for example, in past statements, the Pentagon spokesperson has said they're trying to avoid strategic surprise. So to me, when I hear a phrase like strategic surprise, that's a primal scream in national security terms, because what that means is all of a sudden one day we wake up and we find out someone has a game-changing technology and we missed it. And that means that, billions of dollars of intelligence funding alone just to catch our rivals when they're developing new things didn't work. And then also we don't have that capability that someone else does. So again, before you even get into the kind of stranger aspects of some of these cases, we should be really concerned that we've got a potential strategic surprise scenario that's been left open for 16 years. That's a very long time to be surprised. So I think that, the better argument to make is, not so much that there's a huge vote out there that, demands to get the truth, but rather like this is an incredibly serious issue. It appears there's been no discernible policy. We have no real idea what the heck is going on. So, it's incumbent to get some kind of a response, at least just to kind of know that strategic surprise is off the table. So yeah, I mean, I think there's going to have to be a multiplicity of angles, but yes, I agree with you that the UFO vote, it's always important. I don't want to discount it because I mean it can make an impact, but I think that alone is not necessarily going to get the job done.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I think it's essentially, what we've got is an admission of what we already knew, but at least it is public and out there. And, we all know, and it makes sense that there would be these weird desks, people in intelligence agencies that are working on cases that are strange, that are anomalous, which are the kind of the cross section of science where science comes into research, these sort of things. And I think that, it's just we're moving to a world, hopefully, where it's at least okay to admit that.
Yeah.
But it's what we need to force. I think that is a harder sell, and what we all want. And I think even I'm guessing what Chris Mellon was driving at was also to have a portion where they're also sharing with the public at least somewhat findings and giving an update.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wrote a piece a while back about understanding that UFO or UAP are not one thing. They're at least 4 different things, right? So, UFO or UAP, as it's often said, just means it's something you can't identify in the sky. It's unidentified, right? So it's categorically not a thing in of itself. It's something else. So it could be a natural phenomenon that's just a mistaken observation. It could be an experimental aircraft, for example, one of ours. It could be a foreign adversary. Or there's that 4th category that everyone gets excited about, that it could be something truly strange and exotic. And so to me, the question is, well, what's the distribution, right? So how we know that at least some percentage of sightings are just people not understanding what they're seeing. No one's going to claim that's everything necessarily, but it's certainly not nothing. So you kind of go down the list, and I think you have to have some comfort in being able to examine these different possibilities and really see what they are, especially because of the kind of drone proliferation and everything else that we discussed previously. We just don't have the luxury of living in a world where it's just planes. We have new satellite technologies, all these new things. So yeah, I think it's incumbent on us to be able to have a mature conversation when we see something in the sky we can't identify, to figure it out, as opposed to lapsing into the uncomfortable jokes and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. So somebody will ask, why are they called UAP and not UFOs anymore? Which is a great question. I think what a lot of people don't realize, UFOs to a lot of the public, unfortunately, means aliens or alien spacecraft. And that's not what it means. I mean, unidentified flying objects. It was actually a term coined by the military because they were using flying saucer, which obviously has some other connotations with it and assumptions. But now, even though we moved to UFO for that reason, with all the baggage that the term UFO has, scientists and serious researchers have migrated to this term UAP. I know that Nick Pope says they've been using it in the UK for quite a while, but I think it was actually started by another group, NARCAP, another organization led by Dr. Richard Haynes, who was investigating pilot UFO cases. But anyways, it was kind of a more acceptable term for the scientific community. I think to me, it was always kind of silly. When you have to explain what's a UAP, you're going to have to say a UFO. But I've learned from experience that the scientific community, if you use the term UFO, a lot of people will just turn off. So you've got to use this term UAP. And so that's kind of where we've evolved to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the problem is that over time, whatever the new acronym is, it becomes just as laden with the baggage as the old acronym. There's just a little bit of a momentary pause as someone figures out what it actually means, where you've got an opportunity, to get through some of that accumulated stigma and everything else. But I mean, I certainly can't speak for the scientific community, but like, I'm scientifically trained. To me, it is silly too. I look at it as, clearly these are acronyms for essentially the same thing, something in the sky we can't identify. So let's move on beyond that. But I think there's always these kind of PR repackaging and reimagining of the thing to try to get around the taboo.
Mm-hmm. So in this new world where UAPs are acceptable, where it's, it's out there, that the U.S. is looking into the matter and takes the matter seriously. I think what's interesting as far as results is that at least now we have another country, another Secretary of Defense in Japan, a strong ally and a strong world power. Now also saying, okay, the U.S. takes this seriously. We're going to take it seriously too. And I've instructed, our military, our security defense forces on how to deal with UAP. However, and this is a weird however, and I really doubt it, to be honest. However, we've never had a UAP experience, but we'll definitely keep an eye out and we'll let you know if we do. So it's great that they're taking it seriously in this manner. It's very peculiar because I don't think I've ever heard a government military say they've never had a UAP situation. Many governments have said they've had many, if not, they've had some, if not many. What do you make of that?
Boy, it is a really, really complicated context. So the first thing to kind of take a bigger picture view, right, of Japan. So unknown things in the sky are a really big deal in Japan for a lot of reasons. So in the 90s, for example, there were a series of North Korean missile tests that just completely shocked the country. It ended up instigating a huge number of intelligence and military reforms. It was this kind of wake-up call that they're in a somewhat vulnerable position and can be potentially attacked. And today, the issue is mostly aerial incursions from China. So I think last year there was somewhere on the order of about 1,000 aerial incursions, a little bit less than that in 2019. I would say 2020 is about on track for that. So this issue of like really knowing what's in the sky and what's going on is not just a fun kind of like UFO thing. It's a survival imperative. And the issue has come up several times at very high levels. So interestingly, in 2007 and 2015, the parliament in Japan, the Diet, actually formally raised this question of what is the UFO policy? Has Japan ever encountered UFOs? And both times, someone at a ministerial level, so for us, like a cabinet level official, actually had to answer this question. And yes, the answer was sort of strange. It was, no, we haven't experienced any. But in the 2007 case, they also said there were no grounds to dismiss it either. So the door was kind of left open. And then I think in subsequent years, it's become a little bit more of no, there hasn't been, any particular UAP or UFO encounter, but the government is looking at it. And then recently, what changed was the Minister of Defense Kono in 2020 essentially pointed to the Pentagon video releases and said, he actually even said, I personally don't believe in UFOs, but the DoD has released this video. So I'm paraphrasing now, but I'd like to talk to them and understand what they make of it, what the analysis is. And then from there, the question turned to just what the heck do you do if you encounter a UFO? Because the normal protocols would be, if there's something coming into your airspace, which literally this is almost a daily occurrence that an aircraft aggressively flies into their airspace. You call it on radio, and then there's an escalation of things. You may shoot tracer rounds at it or whatever and try to force it to land. Well, should you do that with a UFO? And it sounds like a sort of silly question, but that has become precisely, the issue. And so, yeah, a few weeks ago, rather famously now, it got to the point where Minister Kono actually spoke to Secretary of Defense Esper in Guam on this question. And we don't quite know exactly what the nature of that conversation was, but it seems that the outcome in Japan is a new policy to, sort of photograph, take as many records as possible, sort of similarly mirroring the UAPTF in some respects. So, yeah, it's an incredibly strange story in terms of trying to understand where does this interest come from, where is it all going? But it's been really, really fascinating to watch.
Mm-hmm. And it makes sense that they would want to partner with the United States, at least in the conversation on the military side, which we've talked quite a bit about, which is to identify technologies, that are emerging technologies that are being used, like drones, for these incursions. And no doubt they would want some help with that, as much help as they can get, especially, like you said, because they're in their precarious situation where they're having these, rather heated kind of encounters with China.
Yeah, I mean, Japan in general is in a sort of at a strategic crossroads of trying to figure out, do they try to keep to the alliance with the United States, which has been frankly shaky in the last few years, just with a general kind of retrenchment of just international interests, I guess, in the United States. There's really no polite way to put it. Do they try to go it on their own? There are massive problems. It's important to remember, too, that the Constitution of Japan is kind of unique in that Article 9 says that Japan pretty much forever renounces war as a means to settle international disputes, and that it constitutionally cannot develop a military that's capable of conducting war. It's intentionally supposed to be a self-defense only kind of construct. Now, over the years, that has changed, and it's become murky as to whether or not there's really an adherence to that. That's always a live, really serious domestic conversation in Japan about whether Japan should maybe even someday change that and actually have a military again. To get back to the strategic question, if they're not going to be with the United States and they're going to try to stand on their own, they need to change the Constitution, triple the defense budget. They need to develop all these capabilities that frankly they really don't have. The third option, which is alarming to consider, but stranger things have happened, would be realigning with China. And in fact, there was actually some concern about that after the United States withdrew from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. Prime Minister Abe at the time actually okayed participation in a large Chinese logistics program, sort of signaling, it was sort of a warning shot, basically, to say that, if the United States isn't serious about the alliance, well, maybe Japan will shift the equation. So, and all of that is going to be in the mind of Esper and Kono in a conversation like that in Guam. They're going to be thinking primarily about the balance of power in East Asia, not about UFOs. UFOs are going to be sort of a side issue. And what I think many other people have been trying to figure out is, well, why exactly? Is it that Kono knows that, twice in recent history, someone in his position has been asked about UFOs in Parliament, and so he ought to have an answer? Now, that could be a reason why. Another answer might be, as we talked about before, a good UFO program has to look at foreign capabilities. Maybe it's a way to try to better understand China's capabilities. We don't know, but there's some sort of a strategic calculus there. And I'm just waiting for a good reporter out there to find out a little more about what happened in that conversation.
Mick West has come up. People in the chat are saying they've noticed that you've gotten to some Twitter debates with him. Mick West is a former or maybe even current game. He makes games, video games. So successful there. And he's also kind of a skeptic. And he's been doing his own, and I don't mean this to put him down, but it's amateur, kind of investigation into the FLIR videos, of which he's not convinced that they're that strange. I guess people are wondering, what do you make of your conversations with him?
Boy, that's a great question. So, believe it or not, Mick was probably one of the first people I actually talked to, on Skype when I was investigating all of this stuff starting out. And we had a great conversation. I personally like Mick. At times, it may seem like our conversations are pretty sharp-elbowed, but I think the reason for that is we both kind of come from an intellectual tradition that when you're debating, you need to be really clear, and you're maybe less concerned about hurting the other person's feelings as you are about kind of laying out what the logic is. So I think that, Mick's general approach of trying to take independent pieces of evidence and to ask questions of them is fine. It's actually, it's a useful way of trying to interrogate, the data that we have available to us. There are some places where I kind of depart from him in terms of his general approach. So I think for my taste, Mick's analysis gets a little bit shaky when he is trying to kind of say, well, what if the object was smaller than it seemed to be? Well, how would that impact the perception of the pilots? Well, unless there's a particular reason to think that was the case, some evidence that tells you that, then, well, what if what if, right? You can sort of drown in what if questions. And I have the same response to the questions about, radar glitches and so on. I think we can actually look into that question. If there were glitches, is there any evidence that there was? And you could build a theory of the case of what the bug would look like, and kind of, try to see if you can find anything to corroborate that. I think instead what's happening is Mick he often describes it this way. He's constructing a list of possible explanations, and he's evaluating how likely each one is. And clearly in his mind, something that's physics defying, really unknown is at the absolute bottom of the list. No debate with that. The problem, though, is that when you use that to kind of say, well, it couldn't possibly have been this, and so therefore, an incredibly unlikely series of events is more likely than this infinitesimally likely exotic craft thing. So there's some issues in the logic there, where I think you have to be a little bit more attentive to the record itself. But anyway, I hope that answers it. They're long discussions. I know they're exhausting sometimes to watch, but I will say this: they help you.
I get tagged on them.
I'm sure you do. I sometimes do too. But as migraine-inducing as they can sometimes be, they help you to understand the record better. They help you to understand exactly what the live questions are. I wrote my first FOIA based on a conversation with Mick, because it became very clear there was a particular piece of evidence that if we had it, it would really be important. So, I think that I would recommend that the UFO community look at Mick as an ally in disguise, because he is going to fight your arguments as hard as he possibly can. And it's going to help you get to know the case better. So,
yeah, I agree with that aspect of it. And in that sense, that's where debate can become helpful, but it also can waste your time. I think, and that's one of the biggest problems that I think that, unfortunately, and I think it's great that he gets the attention that I'm sure he's loving, but I think it's completely wasting so many people's times. I mean, I think he needs to create a list of questions for the experts. The problem with when you're examining something that you have very low expertise on, you don't know what you don't know. And it's especially frustrating when then you argue with the experts against what their expert opinion, when you don't have that expertise. That's what gets me really frustrating.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. I think those issues come up. Frankly, epistemic humility, admitting what we don't know is a big issue, I think, for many researchers from different traditions. I can say that as someone, coming from an academic discipline, you find that among, researchers as not just journalists and people like Mick, who are just really passionately interested in this. So you do have to check that. I mean, my only real complaint with Mick is that sometimes when I've asked him about the implications of his beliefs of, well, what does it tell us about our defense readiness, for example, or the state of, of the military, if this very easily resolved thing has not been resolved for 16 years and it has turned into multi-million-dollar programs. And that's something that, typically when I bring that up, people will say something like, well, the defense world spends so much money. What's a few $1 million? Well, if you do the math, it's many, many school lunches. Money is money, right? So just because it's a small percentage of the budget doesn't mean that those resources, if Mick is right, and this is all, a fool's errand, that could have been used elsewhere. Because what Mick tends to do is to say, no, I think the military is very smart and they sort of understand all of these issues and they, in fact, agree with me. And it's just kind of silly civilians, I think he said at one point, that are interjecting themselves. I just don't think there's any factual basis for that. I think that you have to really kind of reconcile with the implications of your views. So, but I think what he's trying to do is he's more interested in the debate, right? I mean, he wants to, to kind of get into the fray intellectually. I think he's a little less concerned about the policy side of that. And frankly, that's fine. I mean, he doesn't need to be worried about that in order to make, some kind of a contribution. The last thing maybe I'll say about Mick West and about kind of the exhausting aspect of it is, I started writing about this subject this year in the late spring. So for me, a lot of this is new. So, the benefit I get from the debate is it's a way for me to learn the case, really. For some others who have gone through countless iterations of this, particularly the military witnesses, I don't blame them. It is a waste of their time. But, from time to time, Mick and I do like to have our conversations, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. And you don't want to enter into a debate with someone like Mick without knowing your stuff. Or, like you said, I agree. That's definitely a good way to catch up to speed on definitely the minutia regarding all of this, which is important to understand.
Yeah. It's an opportunity to learn. I really sincerely
It
mean
is.
that. It's an opportunity to learn. And if you take it from that perspective, I think it actually can be a useful thing. The key is just not, in any kind of debate, is getting really emotionally involved can be destructive, as frustrating as all this stuff is.
Mm-hmm. So, the next, where we move on, I think, is what's interesting. And what's interesting is, you're talking about how he talked about the silly civilians that are kind of coming in, but that's really not the focus of what's so interesting about what's going on, because it is a government military sort of interaction that we are observing, that we're watching here, with the Navy coming out and saying this is a real thing that we're paying attention to, the Air Force saying essentially no comment, the Senate getting involved and saying, hey, if this is a real thing, then let us in on what the heck's going on here, and create a central location for this information to be examined. All of which, and at kind of that last point being a pretty important evolution of to just that feat alone in being able to move past the stigma and to at least establish an organization to look at unknowns. Even if you're looking at it from the perspective of kind of what we've heard the press office kind of spin it as, is that we're looking at drones and other technologies, that's an important step. That's a good thing to have happen. But the next step is the Nimitz cases. So, Nimitz is a case where they're admitting that this is an unidentified, despite all of their best efforts and their analysis, which we haven't seen by their experts, as to why they think those videos demonstrate, there's unidentifieds. And I'm sure they take into account radar data and witness testimony and other things, like in that executive summary that we've seen. But and we'll get to that. But so where do we go from here is what happens, I think, to those unidentifieds. Those cases like the Nimitz, where does that data go? What's going to happen with that data? Really, I think the only mention of what may happen, Roger Glassell essentially asked that of Susan Goff, I guess is how you say it, but DOD PIO. And she says it'll remain classified, essentially. And I think that's kind of the crux of the issue, really, what it comes down to. And even in Phenomenon, which I got to see a screener, great film by James Fox. I can't wait for everybody to see it. It's coming out October 6th. Chris Mellon makes the point that, these are the interesting things. These are what we want to look at. This is what really the message should be, which is interesting to hear this from him, is that he feels the most important thing in all of this is that these unidentifieds are happening. We have a true, genuine mystery here. And that's the point. But that mystery, where does it go? In other words, okay, we've got this UAP group. They're going to look for potential threats. And but what happens to the Nimitz cases?
Yeah, that's there's so many aspects of that to look at, right? So what happens to a case like Nimitz in terms of public awareness of it is always going to be problematic, because, even today, there are many people that assert that, there's data sets produced by radar and other kinds of instruments that would back up, witnesses, but we don't have access to them. Where basically it's almost impossible to get access to those data sets because they would reveal, key things about our collections capabilities, even though this event happened a long time ago. So those kinds of limits are always going to be there, right? So we shouldn't expect that we're going to get the radar data or something of that nature. But at the same time, I think that there are ways to make productions of data that are responsible, but that are also helpful. So, for example, at the moment, I don't think any of us know how many incidents have there been. How many of these cases have even been examined? We don't have a kind of a statistical account that you very easily could do. You could write up a report that would have tables that would tell you absolutely nothing about our radar capabilities or anything else, or even where these things happened. But it would at least give us a sense of the order of magnitude. Are we talking about something that happens once a year, once every 5 years, or once a month? It'd be really helpful to know that. Are we seeing an increase in the number of these things, or a decrease, or is it flat? We don't know any of that right now. So I think from a policy perspective, we don't have that basic information that would tell us how significant of an issue is this really? Just how much is it happening? And I think that those sorts of things could actually very easily be addressed in a way that's completely respectful of security concerns. So to me, that would be the first step. And then I think from there, we just have to see what the data actually is. And, you know, if we are seeing a lot of incidents and they're increasing, and, you know, the military is struggling to make sense of them, well, that might be an argument that the scientific community, the wider scientific community, needs to be more involved in this issue than they have been. So we'll have to proceed carefully bit by bit. But I don't think anyone should be looking for, you know, we're going to get the high resolution videos in the radar anytime soon. I think we've got to start a little bit more slowly. But the good news is that I think it's very possible to make those steps.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, this document that we're kind of tweeting about recently, and we've been talking about, that was leaked by George Knapp, doesn't seem to get a whole lot of attention. When it came out, I immediately jumped on it, wrote a couple articles about it because I thought it was extremely important and weird that we have this alleged summary, you know, of the Nimitz situation that was leaked by George Knapp. He didn't give us much except to say that it was written by the military for the military, essentially. Everyone assumed it was created by Bass, and I could understand that because I did too. When you read it, it reads more like a non-military person wrote it, and some of the speculation in it is pretty astounding.
Well, we should probably explain that aside from the content of the document, it's the formatting of it too. So the formatting doesn't match any kind of a formal U.S. government product. And yes, there's use of particular acronyms that don't appear, you know, in the Pentagon dictionary and so on, which normally, you know, in a formal product, they are quite careful to make sure that the vocabulary, you know, matches and all of that. So before you even get into the rather incredible account that you're reading, just the way the document looks tells you this isn't a regular, you know, military document.
Mm-hmm. But Lou Elizondo at least has confirmed to me that it was military, written by the military for the military. And he gave me the perception that it was not Bass. You know, I asked Leslie Kane. She told me, I'm not sure who wrote it, but she saw it. It was part of the information she saw when she helped write the New York Times article. And then later she made a comment that it was part of the Bass files. So it was something they had, just not necessarily something they wrote. And then Tim McMillan, another investigator who's got some incredible sources, says he's been told it was an ONI document. So it was written by intelligence, which it does read to me more like an intelligence document than a military document. Right. But what it gives us is some interesting insight into, I guess, the thought process of whoever wrote it, whether that be intelligence, that, you know, they were speculating along the lines of that, you know, perhaps this object came out of a larger object that was out of the water or under the water. I mean, some really strange kind of, really out there kind of possibilities that they were considering. I mean, it's an interesting document.
It is. And it's one, I mean, not to bring Mick up again, but one that I'm very familiar with, because when you start to talk about the details of what happened, it's one of the few documents that we have where you can actually go through it and kind of understand blow by blow and see the a more kind of raw account from the pilots, you know, exactly what they saw and when and so on. And also it does a nice job of describing some of the different technological platforms that were involved, so the different radar systems and things like that. So that's how I'm familiar with it, as just one of the better accounts that we have. So I think two other things maybe to mention about it is that it seemed it was written about 5 years after the event, as far as we know. I think around 2009. And yes, as Tim McMillan said, in his best understanding is that it was written by an ONI analyst, but in an unofficial capacity. So that kind of explains why it is not an official looking document. However, it was apparently some sort of a preliminary attempt to try to understand this incident. But yeah, I mean, it's remarkable because it does assess that these were physically real objects. You know, they were not optical illusions or hologram systems or advanced countermeasures or many of the other things that come up. And then, as you say, yes, it makes some pretty interesting claims about the relationship between some of the things in the water and the things that were flying. Yeah, it's a pretty incredible document. To me, what I find interesting is that that apparently this process started with such an unofficial document, that was ever involved in the process in the first place. And that may speak to the kind of condition that the UAP UFO program was at the time, that there really wasn't a well-funded effort to really, formally study this, but rather someone kind of did their best to put together an analysis and kind of make the case that it was important. That in of itself is pretty striking to me.
Yeah, so there is somebody who's Kevin Childress, who I know has been around the UFO community for a very long time. He says he worked as a DOE special agent, Department of Energy, and he said he's not surprised by the way the document looks at all. He says it's a standard deductive prose format used for investigation reports.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I mean, when I look at it, you see, it's got kind of an executive summary type format where you've got key assessments on the front page. I mean, that's very much in line with what an intelligence product does. And to your comment before about speculation, well, oftentimes intelligence requires looking at things that you can't draw definitive conclusions, but nonetheless, you have to be able to at least make some working assumptions about what's going on. So to me, it was very much in keeping with that. It's just the first question was, well, it's not formal, and we knew that Bass was involved, so it's sort of plausible that perhaps a Bass contractor had, written the document originally. But yeah, I mean, this is an example where the online discussion actually, when I think several researchers pooled their insights, it seems the picture has shifted a bit now, that it's more definitively, an O&I product.
The informality of it is really interesting too, because I think if you look at the narrative and what happened with Nimitz, it was informal. The entire thing was, and it kind of speaks to what Colonel John Alexander, who as an insider in Army intelligence had his own informal investigation regarding UFOs and UFO cover-ups. Conclusion was that the government or military is extremely inept and unable to deal with this issue. And he's just kind of claimed that we've bungled it and we ignore it. And if you examine the Nimitz situation, given that document or witness testimony, that's kind of what we have here. Kevin Day, a radar operator, in charge, supervisor, is seeing these anomalies for several days. And only after several days, finally, he says, can I get somebody to go take a look at these? They say, okay. And he's able to scramble, get Fravor and the rest of the guys scrambled, and they have the tic-tac situation occur. Fravor gets back. Another guy, Underwood, I guess, says, I'm going to go get that thing on camera. They're like, yeah, right. He does. And then this document's written up in an informal matter. And I think that, Brian Bender with Politico has been making the argument. This whole ATIP program is not as big as you guys think. It's very informal. It was, and he's right. This is something foisted upon the Pentagon by Harry Reid. It's not something they wanted to do on themselves. So all of this is almost informal. And in my experience looking at this topic, there's a history of that. In fact, all the Bigelow Group, Eric Davis, Hal Puthoff, they've all been trying to get the government in there to look at these things more seriously. And in order to do that, have a lot of these informal kind of where interested parties in the government are doing this, taking it upon themselves to really look into these things as much as they can, but not part of some kind of formal organized manner. Right. And, to me, that's pretty insightful into how the military's been dealing with all of this.
Yeah. And it sounds strange because I think we tend to have this idea of American military power and intelligence power is absolute. It's the best funded military in the world and it has exquisite capabilities. To be sure, it does. However, it gets a lot of things wrong, or it fails to pay attention to important things. I mean, we have had, significant intelligence failures in regular sorts of issues. So it's not at all surprising that in something strange and something that could be frankly harmful to someone's career, that there would be a lack of attention to it. And I agree that there are a lot of troubling signs that has been the case, that this has never been really handled all that formally, at least as far as we've been able to see. And that brings up the question we were talking about earlier of the pressure and the kind of questions that need to be raised. So it is not me saying that there's an issue of strategic surprise. It was the Pentagon spokesperson saying this whole program is designed to prevent strategic surprise. Okay, if we're talking about strategic survive, we're talking about an existential threat, potentially from a military perspective. So it just certainly does not follow that the way that you treat a potential existential matter is with a couple of intelligence people, and it has no real clear reporting mechanism and no real strategy, no real metrics. That's just not how you handle a matter like that. And I think that that's something that we have to keep in mind as we're going forward, is keep the perspective on this of, if this really is something truly unknown, it's actually important to get to the bottom of it. It's not just a fun kind of navel gazing thing. And the policy has to be, commensurately serious. And hopefully we'll see that. I mean, it seems like what's happening now is at least an attempt to do that. And it remains to be seen, how robust and how long-lived that attempt's going to be. But I think a lot of that depends on us.
And I think we've talked about this before, but I think this is why this has gotten so far. And I do want to speak to this. Kevin Childress, the guy who worked with DOE, says you would only be allowed to investigate if it's in the scope of your responsibility. Yes. Agents don't have free reign to investigate whatever they want. True. However, Elizondo said, it was something he was given permission to look at. Not only that, when it comes to ONI intelligence, just to the point you just made, that would justify their involvement in that they're examining, a potential threat, an unidentified object. The concern was that there weren't mechanisms in place where Kevin Day shouldn't have to, after day 5 or 6, say, hey, can we scramble something to look at this? There should have been procedures in place at day 1. We have this unknown. We need to check these out.
Yeah, well, and getting back to the Japanese question, which is, they're regularly dealing with aircraft trying to come into their territory, and they have those protocols about how they respond. You get on the radio, and eventually, if it goes bad enough, long enough, you start shooting at it. So it raises the question of, well, what should the rules of engagement been for Commander Fravor in that situation? I mean, he was in a situation where he was met with something he could not identify. And he, under his own wherewithal, made the decision to try to get a better look at it. But, maybe there ought to be some parameters on what you should do. I mean, maybe you shouldn't maneuver too violently, or maybe you shouldn't, do anything that may be threatening. I mean, it sounds a little funny discussing it, but I mean, apparently it's a live question because it happened. And these are all issues that have to be worked out. And one of my really growing concerns, the longer that I've looked at this, is that the taboo and the stigma interferes with those conversations, that it just sort of shuts down the thinking, because everyone gets stuck at the level of, well, is this real? Is it aliens, or is it, whatever? And that makes you gloss over a bunch of really important technical questions about, well, what do you do when you're confronted with that situation? Because there's a lot of details you have to work through. And if you're always stuck at, is it aliens, you're never going to kind of get to those. So I'm hoping the longer this goes too, the more the community too is looking at things like drones and becoming more familiar with it. We're kind of, I think, all getting an education in this defense space and realizing, well, it's not as easy as just aliens or whatever.
Right. Because, for instance, this situation, it could be drones. And I would guess that is a lot of the thinking of like the Senate Intelligence Committee and some of the other higher ups. They're thinking, okay, what if those were weaponized drones that they were encountering in Nimitz? Then we totally bungled that situation. We left ourselves open to damage. And of course, now we have, just in the last few days, Iran flying a drone over the Nimitz and getting pictures of it. So we're clear pictures. So what if that drone was weaponized? I think, we've considered drones to be toys for so long, and even these incursions over these nuclear facilities, we've considered them to be toys that now people, this effort is really pushing people towards considering, hey, we need to take these all seriously.
Yeah, you don't. A bad time to have a UFO stigma or taboo is when a weird drone is flying over a nuclear power plant and a guard says, I don't want to report it or I don't want to deal with it because I'm going to seem like I'm talking about UFOs. Because it's just in 2020, you know, we're living in a different world where that could actually be something quite serious that needs to be dealt with. And I mean, I think there's plenty of evidence that those issues have been looked at, but I'm not sure they've gone as far as perhaps they could have. Given the taboo. And it's an extremely important stream of reporting about that I think is actually really underappreciated. Yeah.
So, and I guess that kind of comes around too, is the future of this, where is this headed? And I guess, you know, that's where we'll end up here. We'll end it because I would like your opinion and advice for people, which is that, you know, that's the big hole. That is the big hole that the military keeps looking at, that no doubt Senate intelligence takes seriously. The big hole is, are we using this? Is this taboo keeping us from taking a serious look at drones and other potential technologies we're not aware of? And are we leaving ourselves open? I think that's what sold this UAP task force and all of this to happen. The big question is, if it does happen, and if they do fill that hole, thank goodness, because we're all going to be safer for that. Our military people will all be safer for that. But where does it go from here? What if we have an interest in some transparency regarding the research of real unidentifieds? Are those going to go in a trash bin, or what's going to happen to those? Who's going to look at them? You know, where do we go from here, especially if we're interested in these true unknowns that could pose, and Chris Mellon makes this point in Phenomena, could pose a giant scientific breakthrough.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that if there really is something, you know, truly exotic, unusual going on here, it's the biggest story, you know, ever. Essentially, it's incredibly important. So, you know, at a minimum, there would be a tremendous kind of opportunity cost for not pursuing something so remarkable if there's reason to think that it's really there and it's going on. So I think there's a couple of different answers. I think at one level, it's what we talked about earlier in terms of setting up pressure for there to be reports that are maybe conservative in the information that they give out, that many people in the community would like to see pictures and so on. Instead, you're going to get statistical tables. But I can tell you that kind of coming from the scientific community and a little bit more kind of policy circles, that will actually do more in a way, because it will give you a picture that you can then point to and say, this is happening at a certain amount of regularity with a certain sort of trend. These are true unknowns, and we can kind of quantify a little bit of just what the issue actually is. And then also it makes it easier to make the argument of, well, if the military hasn't solved a case like this in 16 years, what's to make us think they're going to solve it in the next 3 or 5? Something isn't happening. So, and that something might be, for example, a relationship with a broader scientific community. It kind of gives an inroad to start making those arguments of, hey, if you want to solve this, and really you must solve it, given the strategic environment that we're in, you're going to need to bring in more people. And yes, it's going to be difficult for you to do that, but there's ways to go about it. So that's one. Two is, this is becoming it seems an international issue in the sense that at least the Japanese are looking at it. We've heard some comments from Lou Elizondo, you know, mostly on social media, but nonetheless saying that an international strategy is something that TTSA is considering. It remains to be seen exactly what that would look like. But if we start to head into a world where there's a little bit more cooperation on these issues, and that's probably a whole other hour or two that we could do, that has a potential too for shifting the dynamic, because it no longer becomes just an American security issue, but it becomes kind of a broader issue. So I think there's multiple moving pieces here. And again, just for context, it's like we're 39 days from the election. And so, you know, the question of who's going to sit in the Director of National Intelligence chair is very much an open question, let alone Secretary of Defense and all the rest. So there's a huge amount of kind of like political calculation that's going to happen in the next, 40 to 50 days. That's going to really have a major bearing on all of this stuff too. So it kind of makes sense that things are a little murky, I think, at the moment.
And I would say, and it's murky too, what effect any administration change will have. We don't know
Right.
how friendly or unfriendly, any administration is towards this. Childress
Right.
has another question I think that you might find interesting, or a comment. He says, my personal opinion is decades of deception or perhaps ineptitude have created massive systemic problems that pervade government and commerce beyond UFO. And I added the ineptitude. He says decades of deception. But
Mhm.
yeah, is this issue systemic? Maybe that's why major uh, campaigns like Mellon's are necessary.
Yeah, I think I don't know that I would necessarily say deception exactly, but I think that's basically right, and that there are some systemic issues. So, in fact, one of the projects I've been working on, I've been kind of doing an experiment to see, is I've been kind of reviewing books from national security literature and history that have nothing to do with UFOs, but yet talk about UFOs. So, for example, I was looking at the Iraq War and the intelligence issues there, and it's just seeing, because you see many of the similar kinds of problems of something that's been overlooked or it hasn't been taken seriously, and then all of a sudden it becomes a major problem, and there's a kind of scramble to come up with an appropriate response. And normally you would think, surely there must be rooms full of people who work on, Iraqi security issues all day long. Well, maybe, but maybe not, right? So the history is inevitably more complicated. So actually, yeah, I do think there's some evidence that there's all kinds of areas that have been neglected, particularly in the technology space. I guess just to button this one up, I would recommend reading Christian Brose's The Kill Chain. It's got kind of a rough title, but it's well worth your read. So it's from a former senior staffer, kind of like a Mellon sort of figure, but in the Senate Armed Services Committee. And he wrote an analysis of basically everything that's wrong in kind of defense policy making right now. It's a scary read. It's an extremely scary read. So yeah, in short, yeah, there's some reasons I think to be concerned in more than one policy area at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of funny. It just brings me back to John Alexander's points, because he's like he's shocked that people are not open to the idea that our military can be really kind of inept in this arena, whereas most people are give it a given that the government's a mess and everything, but they can't buy it when it comes to UFOs. They think they're masterminds in
Yes, yeah,
deception.
right. We live in this head spinning contradiction. And I mean, I think the reason is because there's something to that contradiction. Like sometimes at a policy level, things go cartoonishly wrong, where it's almost you can't believe how sort of stupid the decision making is. But then on the other hand, there are also plenty of capabilities that are truly, I mean, they're called sometimes exquisite capabilities. Meaning that they're so technologically complex, so advanced that they're kind of mind-boggling too. So we live in that contradiction as a country, where we're capable of doing profound things and we're also capable of shooting ourselves in the foot. We do both regularly. And I think when it comes to the UFO issue, we're left asking, well, which is it? Did someone mastermind the best cover up of all time, or are we kind of clueless here? That's the question.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. I think we're pretty much out of time. So glad to have you back. I would say I hopefully will have you back again in the future, because I love our conversations. I think that I'm very happy that you're now writing about and focusing on this topic, because your insights are very helpful. Thank you so much for.
Thank you. I appreciate that. These are always great. So yeah, this is awesome. I look forward to doing more.
Yeah, so we'll have more Rojas reports coming up. And, I'm definitely going to be sticking to more of the policy, more breaking down government and science, and the institutions, the mainstream institutions, and how not only how they are affected by all of this, but how, those interested in moving the ball forward, how they do so. So, for example, there's people like Nick Pope who have worked in government. I'll be interviewing him next week, and we'll be talking similar sort of topics. And he has insight from the MOD. I'll also have in a couple of weeks Kevin Knuth, and I think that's a really important conversation, because he's a physicist. How do we get this the scientific community to take this more seriously? And the question that you and I were just talking about: how do we get how do we get the data, like the Nimitz case, the real unidentifieds, into the hands of scientists, and what scientists to do what with it? Those sort of things, which is kind of where I think many of us would like all of this to evolve to. So those sort of discussions that we'll have. So Kevin will be in a couple of weeks, and then about 3 weeks we'll have James Fox, whose film The Phenomenon launches on October 6th. And I highly, highly, highly recommend everybody watch it. It puts together a very compelling argument for this phenomena. So it's got a good title. But I think it's going to be especially eye-opening for those people who are really getting interested in this topic now, to show that, there's a rich history of military interest and involvement in this field, and witnessing things, and demonstrates kind of how they've been tackling that over the years. So stay tuned to the Rojas Reports. Like I said, the live versions like this one will be open for everybody, and then it will go into the archives, which you just have to push that join button to see. And then, of course, if you join on Patreon as the audio level, you'll get those as an audio also. So thank you again, Adam. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Let me play one of my cool outro videos here now. Here we go.